Well, the first thing to say about William Charles Wentworth is that he's one of the first Australians born of European parents. Australia, as we know, in August 1790 off Norfolk Island. His mother was a convict and his father should have been a convict, it was just they never caught him. The Wentworths were one of the most distinguished families in Great Britain. I say that for a couple of reasons. First of all, they were one of the wealthiest families in Britain. The head of the Wentworth family had an income of about £8 million a year. This is in 1780 pounds, which is a lot more money today. Second of all, they were politically influential, and Charles Watson Wentworth, the head of the family in England, was Prime Minister twice in the 18th century, in the second half of the 18th century. And third of all, he was a Marquess, which is the second highest rank of the British peerage, and so he ranked highly in the House of Lords as well. Now, William Charles Wentworth's alleged father was a fellow called Darcy Wentworth, and Darcy Wentworth came from a poor branch of the Wentworth family, and they were based in Northern Ireland. I think they probably went over there in Cromwell's time during the English Civil War, and Darcy's father was an innkeeper in Portadown. Darcy himself was a very bright young lad, and he trained to be a doctor, not quite the sort of skill set that you'd have today to be a doctor, and perhaps not quite the same difficulty getting there, but nevertheless he did well. And once he qualified in Ireland, he went over to London to improve his qualifications. And whilst he was in London, he started running around with his wealthy English relatives. And that's, I think, what got him into trouble, because he tried to keep up with them as they went round the gaming houses and no doubt the bordellos and all sorts of other places. And he just didn't have the money to keep up with these English Wentworths. And so, and I use the word allegedly, and allegedly is one of those wonderful lawyerly words which basically means you can say what you like without any responsibility. Well, I hope that's right. Allegedly, he held up people on the King's Highway to supplement his income for the gaming houses. And we know of at least 4 separate occasions that he was involved in hold-ups, that he was allegedly involved in hold-ups, because these are trials which have been reported and which you can actually find if you Google. So if you go online and you Google the Old Bailey site will come up, and then you put in Darcy Wentworth and pretty quickly you'll get to his cases, and you can decide for yourselves whether or not you think he's innocent or guilty, because you'll be able to read the transcripts of the evidence that the jury's heard in each case. You can't, of course, see the witnesses, and that means a bit. But nevertheless, for what it's worth, I think there was a reasonable doubt in each case. Anyway, after the 4th occasion on which he'd appeared before a judge and gotten off, the judge looked at him and said, "Mr. Wentworth, I think it would be an idea if you went to New South Wales on your own steam before we send you there in chains." And so he got on a Second Fleet transport, the Neptune, as a free man right at the end of December 1789. Now, some of you probably know the Neptune was the worst convict transport ever to come here. It had the highest death rate per person on board, and we know that because the convict vessels and their death rates and so forth are pretty well known, and this was the absolute worst. But he was coming as a free passenger. Also on board was a young girl called Katherine Crowley. She was 17. She'd been convicted and sentenced to transportation for stealing linen from her employer up in Newcastle in, I think it's northern England. And she was with a number of other convict women on what was a hell ship. And what did happen was the women got the run of the ship. The convict women got the run of the ship. The male convicts were kept fairly closely confined. And there must have been something about this girl which caught Darcy Wentworth's eye. We do know that he was a ladies' man, because whenever he was put on trial, the newspaper records show that a number of ladies used to turn up in the public gallery and cheer him on. So he had something going from this guy, and obviously there was some mutual attraction there. And anyhow, she ended up, in effect, obtaining his protection, really. And the captain, who otherwise was a pretty harsh individual, didn't seem to mind this. Apparently, 6 months later, or 7 months later, as a result of this, William Charles Wentworth was born. We know that Darcy got on board this ship right at the end of December 1789, because that was when he was released from custody. The court records show that. And there are some records on Norfolk Island showing that there was a William Crowley, who later was William Charles Wentworth, his name was changed, who was on stores at that time. So he was at the most generous, he was a very premature baby. And so there's always been a doubt about whether Darcy Wentworth was his father. When you look at the other possible suspects, one was Nicholas Nepean, Evan Nepean's brother, who was the captain on the, a marine captain I should say, on the Neptune, and another one was John MacArthur, who was on the Neptune for a short time, but I can't imagine John MacArthur running off behind his wife's back and having an affair with a convict. So I do think that Darcy Wentworth was probably the father, and certainly from the descriptions of the two of them in later life, there's, to me, an unmistakable resemblance in many ways. But most importantly, Darcy Wentworth claimed William as his son and treated him as his son. So they got to Sydney on the Second Fleet, which was a hell fleet, and just to tell you or show you, it really demonstrates how bad it was. Katherine Crowley came ashore about 8 months pregnant, and she was considered fit enough to go on to Norfolk Island, because the fittest of the convicts on the Second Fleet were being sent straight to Norfolk Island, where it was considered they'd have a better chance with food and supplies out there. So that gives you an idea of what the rest of what the people who weren't fit enough to go to Norfolk Island were really like. And there are records of them just laid out on what even then seems to have been a grassy slope down about where the Museum of Contemporary Art is these days, just people laid out all over the place, dead and dying. So they went to Norfolk Island, and Darcy Wentworth was there as a surgeon, and he was there as a convict overseer. And then they came back here in the mid-1790s and ended up out at Parramatta, where Darcy was again the assistant surgeon. Then in 1800, Katherine Crowley died. We don't quite know why. She was still a very young woman. She'd given birth to 2 other sons by this time, and Darcy found himself with 3 young boys. In 1802, when Wentworth was 12, he and his next youngest son, Darcy Jr., got sent off to England to be educated. Darcy was an entrepreneur and a risk taker, and the sort of risks he'd taken to hold up people on the King's Highway, he'd used out here to better himself by getting the exclusive rights to deal in rum and things like that. This was basically Darcy's forte. He was a real wheeler and dealer and got on with successive governors, and he was charming and all the rest of it, and made a lot of money. So these boys went to England to be educated, and I sort of always take a little bit of time to take this in. They went, today you would call them unaccompanied children. So occasionally you go out to Kingsford Smith Airport and you'll see a kid running around in the company of an airline hostess or steward, on their way to somewhere overseas. Well, these boys were in that situation on a ship and crossed the equator 3 times to get to England. They went up to Canton first of all, then down around to India, and then down around the Cape of Good Hope and up to London. So it's 3 times across the equator as unaccompanied children. In England, they were looked after by Darcy Wentworth's London agent, and occasionally they were ushered into the presence of Lord Fitzwilliam, who at that time was the head of the Wentworth family. He was keen to see the Wentworths do well in New South Wales because Darcy had left under a bit of a cloud, and yet worried that Darcy might not, meet expectations. And so these Wentworth boys were sort of, at one and the same time, kept a little bit at arm's length, but nevertheless there was intense interest in them from the Wentworths in England. And so occasionally they'd be ushered into Lord Fitzwilliam's presence and they'd get a guinea's pocket money and that sort of thing. They got a very good secondary education, as we would say today, in England. William Charles was an exceptionally bright student, and after finishing his secondary school, he came back to Sydney in 1810. In a way, it was a sort of giant reverse gap year, and he spent a couple of years here at a bit of a loose end. In 1813, with Blaxland and Lawson, he crossed the Blue Mountains. Now, that story is very well known, so I don't spend a lot of time on it, except to say that Wentworth was the junior person of the 3 of them, and I think Blaxland was the leader. And Blaxland does credit Wentworth with finding a way down the Blue Mountains. Now, when you go up the Great Western Highway, I think you're essentially tracking west until you come to Katoomba, And before they put the new road in through Katoomba, you used to go out and do a sharp right-hand turn past a petrol station. And that's where you sort of end up turning from the west to the north. And it essentially follows what they did. So they got as far west as they could, and they of course met a vertical cliff. So then they're tracking north up through Blackheath and all that area looking for a way down. They passed what's now I think called the Mitchell Pass, and that bridge that you go over to get down into the Hartley Valley. They passed that, they didn't see what I guess would have been outcroppings of rock and so forth, suggesting a way down. I wonder sometimes why they missed it, and then, you know, I go and have a walk on a Blue Mountains trail, and you see these gum trees and so forth growing out of the sides of the hills, and oftentimes it's very hard to see what's immediately below you. You can see across, say, the other side of the Gross Valley, but it's quite hard to look sort of straight down, and I think that's probably what happened with them. They just missed it. Anyway, got up to Mount York, and it was Wentworth, and Blaxland credits him with this, who found a way down the mountain, which obviously is a critical part of the trip. He was still at a loose end after that, and so he decided to go back to England. He essentially had two choices. One was to join the army, and one was to go into the law. Now, we're talking 1816 here, and 1816 was a bit like 1945, which maybe some people in the room can remember, which is to say Britain had just won a massive war, which had gone on for years. In the case of the Napoleonic Wars, they'd been going on for a quarter of a century. And that meant that, as with the army in Australia, say in November 1945, the last place you'd go looking for a career is as an army officer, because everybody was being demobilised, and it was no different in Britain in 1815-16. So he decided to go into the law. He had what they call a cast in the eye. It's sort of an eye that's sort of offset. And people at the time said that that precluded him from studying medicine like his father, and so medicine was never an option. So he read law. Now in those days, what that meant was the courts in those days were located in Westminster Hall, which you would have seen featured recently during the Queen's Jubilee celebration. It's a wonderful, massive structure built in the time of William Rufus, William the Conqueror's son. It's almost 1,000 years old now, and the courts were in that giant hall. And Wentworth was basically an apprentice. That's to say, he'd sit there during the day with his master barrister, sitting by his side, learning the trade, watching him in court, the same way an apprentice would watch, say, a skilled shipwright bending or steaming oak beams or something like that. And at night he hit the law books to study up on the theory. And all was going well. And at this stage, I think he was passing himself off as an English gentleman, young English gentleman, taking sort of English airs and graces and that sort of thing, to make a career at the English bar, until something happened here which turned his life upside down. Governor Macquarie was getting into a lot of trouble. We're talking here 1816, 1817. He was running into very heavy weather with the exclusives. That's to say, people like John MacArthur and Gregory Blaxland and others, who were people of independent wealth who had never been convicts and were in that sense free settlers, although MacArthur first of all came here as an officer. And Macquarie was favouring the ex-convicts, and this incensed people like MacArthur and Blaxland. And he was favouring them by, amongst other things, putting them on the bench of magistrates. Now, you just sort of got to take that in a little bit. I mean, I think I'd get a little bit irritated if the Attorney General, my successor in the seat of Epping, Greg Smith, came out and made an announcement that an ex-convict was being appointed to the bench of magistrates at Ryde or at Hornsby. And heaven forbid that I would have to go and appear before that person on a drink driving charge or something. I'd be a bit cranky if I was appearing before an ex-convict. And MacArthur and co were similarly pretty upset. Macquarie in that way was enlightened in a way that we really aren't enlightened even these days. And what happened was this campaign built up in Sydney to put the skids under Macquarie. And complaints went back to London by various people here complaining that Macquarie was appointing all these ex-convicts to the bench. And one of the allegations was that Darcy Wentworth, the highwayman, was not just appointed a magistrate, he was actually the Chief Magistrate of New South Wales. And this started doing the rounds of the House of Commons. and a fellow called Henry Bennett got upset by this, pro-MacArthur, anti-Macquarie, and he started putting it about that Darcy Wentworth, the highwayman, was on the bench in New South Wales. Well, this started doing the rounds of the bar, and pretty soon Wentworth got to hear about it. He was livid, absolutely furious, stormed off round to this MP's house and threatened him to a duel. And the MP said, well, just steady on a minute. I might have been wrong that your father was convicted of anything, and for that I apologise, but what you've got to understand is that your father was repeatedly tried for crimes, and here are the transcripts, and sort of put down in front of him the transcripts of evidence. And this, I think, transfixed Wentworth and caused him deep, deep embarrassment and changed his life. And in that way also, I think, changed the history of Australia, which I'll come to. I can say this because I was a barrister for a little while. Barristers are strange creatures. They have a very high opinion of themselves by and large, not always warranted. There's a pecking order, a very intense sort of pecking order, and they're always very, very interested in what other barristers are sort of thinking of them. And they gossip, never about anything that's under solicitor-client privilege, of course, but they do gossip. They're incredible gossips, a lot of them. And so I just have in my mind's eye this picture of Wentworth trying to pass himself off as this young up-and-coming English barrister, trying to put as much distance between him and this convict colony as possible. And all of a sudden every barrister's sort of saying around the courts at Westminster, oh, he's one of those Wentworths. Because, of course, some of the most senior people at the criminal bar would have appeared for his father, not once but probably repeatedly. And so he was humiliated by this. He nevertheless stuck it out, got admitted to the bar, and then promptly decided to cut and run and come back to New South Wales, which is what he did. He came back with a fellow called Wardell, Robert Wardell, who was also a barrister, but more importantly the editor of a paper in London, and they came on the same ship. And on the way they stopped at Tenerife to resupply, and Wentworth and Wardell went ashore and ordered a number of cartons of dark brown beer. Then the captain gave the signal, all aboard or something or other, and they all raced back to the ship, but the beer hadn't cleared customs. And so Wentworth and Wardell were sort of standing over the stern rail as the captain sort of gave the order to hoist the sail and raise the anchor and all this sort of thing. And he wouldn't wait for the beer to clear customs. And so they had to stand sort of watching this beer receding in the distance, going off in the sun. And they got pretty angry. And as the voyage progressed, things got worse. The cabins leaked, the food went off, and one thing and another. And they got to Sydney pretty cranky. So the first thing they did was to get admitted as barristers in the new Supreme Court here. There was a new Chief Justice, a fellow called Francis Forbes. And then they immediately turned around and sued the owner of the ship that had brought them here for a lousy voyage. And they won 80 guineas damages. So it was a sign to all the world, or at least all of Sydney, that these two new barristers, they were really the first practising barristers in New South Wales, that they meant business. The next thing they did was to set up the first independent newspaper in the colony. There had been a paper called the Gazette, which had been running, I think, from 1803, but it was a heavily censored government paper. And they just set up a paper called The Australian, about 140 years before Rupert Murdoch thought of the idea. And Governor Brisbane, who had replaced Macquarie, in his wisdom, let the paper run, so to speak. He just let them produce it. And they became very assertive and started running a campaign. And this is where Wentworth, I think, his great contribution to Australian history starts to emerge. They campaigned for a number of things: trial by jury, a free press, an elected parliament, I should say, and responsible government. And they were the great things that Wentworth campaigned for and ultimately achieved. All of these things, by the way, were things that followed like night day in most British colonies, but not here because this place was a penal colony. Initially, Brisbane, being an enlightened fellow, let them have their say. And then he went home and things changed under his successor. I should say, the Australian being used at the masthead of a paper in 1824, I've always thought is quite extraordinary. The word was not in use. Matthew Flinders, I think, at first used the word to describe the Australian continent on his maps, but it wasn't widely in use, and the only other person that used it in a couple of dispatches, I think, was Macquarie. But the first people who proclaimed it were Wentworth and Wardell in their newspaper, The Australian. And to me, it just screams out Wentworth asserting his Australianness. Brisbane's replacement was a fellow called Ralph Darling. Ralph Darling was a Lieutenant General, which is an extremely senior rank in the Army, but his father had been a Sergeant Major. And I think he was somebody who had a Lieutenant General's rank with a Sergeant Major's personality, which is a very, very dangerous combination. And he was going to get up the wrong way with Wentworth, and pretty quickly he did. And they started... Ralph Darling, I think, meant well. I don't think any of the governors meant badly. It's just that some of them were much more conservative and buttoned down than others, and Darling was certainly in the former category, and Wentworth was demanding constitutional change, so the clash was potentially on. And they clashed over minor things until a major event happened, and it started in a bit of an odd way. Soldiers would come out here to serve in New South Wales, and despite the fact it was a penal colony, relatively speaking, they'd see a land of milk and honey, because soldiers discharged back in England actually did it pretty rough, and living was very difficult. And they could see people here going off up the Hawkesbury River and getting a land grant and doing very well. And a bit of a rort started to occur. So soldiers would commit a minor crime, suffer a minor penalty, get a dishonourable discharge, which was what they were after, and then they'd be able to disappear up the Hawkesbury on a little acreage and live happily ever after, in a way that they couldn't dream of back in England. And there were far too many soldiers for this Lieutenant General with the Sergeant Major's personality doing this, and an example had to be set. So two fellows, Suds and Thompson, stole a couple of small items. They were brought before the court, they were tried, they were convicted, and they were sentenced. And then Darling stepped in, and he increased their sentence. He sentenced them to jail in irons with a steel collar around the throat, 2 steel collars around each ankle, joined up by chains and spikes out from the neck. The chains were short so that they couldn't lie out flat at night to go to sleep. And one of the soldiers, unbeknown to the governor, was very ill, and he died while he was in chains. Well, Wentworth hit the roof and accused the governor of murder. Now, you might say that's a bit extreme. Well, in fact, it wasn't, because another governor in another colony had been tried and convicted of murder in similar circumstances, and he'd been executed. And the great mistake that Ralph Darling had made was to increase the penalty of the court on this soldier. And it couldn't be done then any more than it could be done now. So the Premier of New South Wales, the Prime Minister of Australia, powerful as they may be, cannot step in and increase the sentence of a court. It can only be done, of course, through an appeal court. And the same situation then. So the dilemma for Darling was he actually acted illegally, causing somebody's death, and he was in desperate strife. And so as Wentworth went for him, as only Wentworth could, relations deteriorated. And this was played out in the newspaper. And by this stage, there were other newspapers as well. And they all went after Darling on this point. So Darling tried to shut them down. He tried to licence them, he tried to register them, he tried to levy a stamp duty. At one point he managed to get a couple of them convicted of criminal libel, the editors, and they were put in jail, and to his consternation they kept writing defamatory articles from their jail cells. And he became quite desperate. And in the end he cottoned onto this idea that the people who were working for these papers were actually all convicts. You couldn't find free people who were printers, you couldn't find free people who were compositors, and you couldn't find free people who were journalists. Now you ask the political class up there in Macquarie Street whether journalists are criminals, and you'll get a pretty consistent answer. I don't have to comment on that these days. But what Darling did was to say, well, hang on a minute, all these convicts are assigned by me. So what I'll do is I'll withdraw their assignments to the newspapers, I'll send them all over the Blue Mountains, over the other side of the Blue Mountains, cracking rocks in Bathurst, in chain gangs, and that way I'll shut the newspapers down. And for a short while it worked. They couldn't really continue. But there were complaints now being made about Darling to London, and this really overstepped the mark with the British Secretary of State of the day, and he said, "You've abused your power as governor to shut these papers down, you are recalled." It was a huge win for Wentworth, and I think it was the most important single thing he ever did. What I'm saying in another way is that it's from that time in 1831 that I think we've had a free press in this country. And I think it's the most single important constitutional check and balance on political power that we have. And I can sort of say that from 19 years in the Parliament, where I know that despite the ICAC, the courts, the Auditor General, the Ombudsman and all sorts of other worthy bodies, the one mob that will make a politician pull up more quickly and more sharply than any other is a press article and a sustained press campaign on some particular point. It is very, very harsh, blunt at times, but it's very effective. And you might say today one of the disturbing developments I think going on right now is the way the Herald is now under great pressure. And I think if Wentworth were alive today, he'd be absolutely horrified. Not that I think there's anything anybody can do about it. But that was his greatest legacy. And from that, of course, derived under the same principles are things like the freedom on talkback radio and the freedom on Q&A to tweet and all that sort of rubbish, which I can't do. But you know what I mean. And all that is derived out of the same principles from 1831. When Darling was recalled, Wentworth decided to have a party. He thought there was something to celebrate, so he put an ad in the paper, as the lawyers say, an ad to all the world, an open ad to all the world. Come to my place, Vaucluse House, by this stage, and enjoy free beer, free gin. We know this because it was in the ad. Gin seemed to be the big tipple of the day. An ox on the spit, you know, lamb, mutton, wouldn't be lamb, mutton, all that sort of thing. And so on the appointed day, which was the day of poor old Darling's departure, by the way, nobody who went to his party could even utter the word Darling in the context of the governor. It was a sort of a contradiction in terms, his name and the man they knew. And so about 4,000 of them turned up at Vaucluse House. And Wentworth, who was a huge man, his wife's biographer says he stood about 6'5". I've never been able to get the precise measurements, but she's pretty confident about that. So a giant, a massive physical shape as well as just being tall. Booming voice, we know that from descriptions. Flaming red hair and a temper to match. As these people started to knock off the gin, particularly, the party degenerated, and not even the massive Wentworth could control them. And so Ralph Darling, meanwhile, is trying to leave Sydney Cove with still no circular quay at this time. Rowed out to his boat, anchor up. Word goes round Vaucluse House, he's just about to pass Bradley's Head, and the word passes through the crowd, and as this poor old bloke goes round Bradley's Head, this drunken mob surge forward onto the foreshores of Vaucluse Bay and give him a great Australian farewell. And so he's sort of left to sort of sail out the heads with all these sort of epithets ringing in his ears. Wentworth settled down after that and went back to the bar until in 1835 his friend Wardell was murdered by bushrangers at Petersham, which was then in the outback. A concept I find very difficult to grasp. I used to go down through Petersham railway station once upon a time. You'd roar through there at 80 kilometres an hour and I couldn't believe it was ever the outback, but it was. And people could be ambushed by bushrangers as Wardell was. It changed Wentworth. He left the bar and he went on the land. And like a lot of people who go on the land, he became very conservative. And he became Joh Bjelke-Petersen conservative. At the same time, though, he was pushing for an elected parliament. Trial by jury, by the way, had come by this stage. I don't talk about that. I unfortunately haven't really got the time. But he'd also pushed for a partially elected parliament, and this came in 1843, and he was one of the first elected members for Sydney at that time in the Legislative Council, partially elected. And then he was pushing for self-government. What do I mean by that? I mean, these things are so much taken for granted today, nobody even thinks about it. In 1843, if you'd ask yourself, who was the Chief Executive of New South Wales, the answer would have been the Governor. So you'd say, Mari Bashir's the Chief Executive of New South Wales. No Premier, no Premier. And what Wentworth was about was getting that executive power transferred to the governor, from the governor to somebody who's responsible to the colonists, who were being taxed but were not having any say in how the money was being spent. Now, these governors were conscientious, but they were ambitious people, and they were always looking to London because, of course, that's where their next job would come from. And so Wentworth wanted them focused on what the colonists wanted. And so that's how the push for self-government came. There was pretty much general agreement on this, and the British weren't really going to stand in their way. They'd learnt their lesson from the Americans. But this great fight developed within New South Wales. And what it all got down to was, if you want the right to vote, to choose who in effect will be the Premier, well, the big question is who's going to get the right to vote. And the wider the franchise, Wentworth quickly figured out, the less the power of the squatters, of which he'd become one, would be. To put it another way in contemporary terms, it's the fight that still goes on with the National Party, or dare I say it, the shooters, and in the New South Wales Upper House, for example, and governments of the day. And so Wentworth was trying to maintain power whilst ceding the inevitable that there would be a widespread franchise in the lower house. And like all people who try to run that fight, he retreated pretty quickly to the upper house and decided that the fight would be occurring up there. And he pushed for an aristocracy, a local aristocracy. Who would be in this aristocracy? Well, all his squatting mates. And what happened pretty quickly was, and this is one of the great things I think about the Australian political public, is that Wentworth's idea got ridiculed, which is to say people just laughed it out the back door. And we have this capacity to ridicule politicians. I've been the butt of it on a number of occasions. It's quite unpleasant, I have to say, but very effective. Most other countries don't use it, and I think it's a wonderful weapon. And he was laughed out. So they accused him of wanting to be the Duke of Vaucluse. They accused his mate, James MacArthur, of wanting to be the Earl of Camden. They said that each of them would have rum kegs on their coats of arms. And they said that what they wanted to set up was a bunyip aristocracy. And even Wentworth could sort of figure out this wasn't going to fly. And so he retreated to a compromised position, which was a sort of an appointed upper house. And then he went off to London to push and lobby for this to go through the House of Commons. And it did. It was another one of his great legacies, responsible government, which came in 1856. While he was there, he pushed another idea, which was a confederation of Australia. And he was the first Australian to do that. What he wanted was for representatives of each colonial legislature to come together at a central place from time to time to make laws on intercolonial issues, one of which was lighthouses. And you might say that's an odd sort of thing to be making laws about. Well, in those days, lighthouses were as important to people as the control tower at Mascot Airport is today, because they governed the safe passage of boats, just as the air control tower there governs the safe passage of everybody who takes off or lands at Kingston Smith Airport. And different colonies had different standards for lighthouses. And it was vitally important to get standardisation so that a ship coming, say, through, what is it down there, Cape Lewin, I think, and then coming across through Albany and then down around the south of Van Diemen's Land as it was, and then up to New South Wales, that all the lighthouses would be showing consistent messages, etc., etc. And this required uniform laws. So that's an idea of one thing that he wanted them to make laws about. The British government said, fine, we're not going to stand in the way of you people the way we stood in the way of the Americans, but you've all got to agree on it. And one of the great tragedies of Wentworth's life, in a way, was having been the spearhead for responsible government, which was then taken up pretty quickly by all the other colonies, he had to stand there and watch them say no, because having just got all this power, the last thing they wanted to do was to give any of it up to a central federal authority. And it was another 40 or 50 years, of course, before federation came into place, and Wentworth didn't live to see it. He came back to Australia briefly, in 1861, 1862, went back to England again and died in 1872. His remains were brought back here. He was offered the first state funeral to an Australian by a parliament, and at his funeral here, 70,000 people lined the route from St Andrews to Vaucluse House to pay their respects. That was half the city's population. And he remained a very divisive political character, even in death. But I think they turned out in those numbers because they realised that this was the man who'd first displayed an Australian identity to the world, you see. Now, I just want to finish up by trying to tell you a couple of stories about Wentworth to give you an idea of what he was like. First of all, as a barrister. Look, there are a lot of barristers in New South Wales. Somebody told me recently there are now over 2,000 of them. God knows what they do. I don't know how most of them make a living. You probably get by with about 800, I'd say, and then have some change. Anyway, I was a very mediocre barrister, and most barristers are reasonably mediocre, do a reasonable job to a reasonable degree and so forth. If you're in very serious trouble, however, and any one of us could be in very serious trouble, particularly anybody who drives this afternoon, if you're unlucky enough to run into somebody in a car, by definition, you're in very serious trouble. It may not be your fault, but the chances of you being charged are very high, and then you want a top-notch barrister, believe me. And there are only a few people that you'd want to go to, and they share a few things in common. One is they're very knowledgeable in the law. The second is they can read a jury very well and read a judge very well and read their opponent very well. The third is they're very fast on their feet, they're quick-witted, and above all, they're utterly fearless, which is to say they're fearless of their opponent and they're fearless of the judge and they're fearless of the government. And you'll find barristers may have a combination of those things, but to get all of those things is not common. And there may be only a handful of barristers at any one time who have all those characteristics to the degree required to get you out of a sticky situation. My problem would be if I needed a barrister like that, I couldn't afford to hire one. What I'm trying to say is that's the sort of barrister I think Wentworth was. One of his clients, and we're going back now to 1824, was a fellow called Francis Cox, who made ship's anchors down at Sydney Cove. He came to see Wentworth and he said, "I'm not the client, my young daughter is, but I'm here to speak on her behalf. She's 20, she's been engaged to a fellow called Captain Payne, and he goes away on these voyages and mucks around, we hear, and comes back and promises her everything under the sun and then goes off again and mucks around again. She's remained faithful to him, she's getting sick and tired of this, and she wants satisfaction. What do we do?" So Wentworth said, "Well, we'll sue for breach of promise of marriage." And so the case was brought for breach of promise of marriage, and Captain Payne was represented in great tradition of the bar by Robert Wardell, Wentworth's great friend, and they appeared against each other in this case. Now, Wentworth put young Sarah in the witness box and she went through her evidence about how she'd been faithful and blah, 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 and Captain Payne had done all these dreadful things. And there's one thing in the, sort of not exactly pleadings, but in the complaint, which was that Captain Payne had gone off at right angles with a wealthy widow called Mrs. Leverton. And I read this about 3 times and I found myself going like that in the air to try and sort of figure it out. It's quite a nice expression, actually. And so anyway, all this evidence was given. And then Wardell puts Payne in the box, and Payne sort of says, "Interesting tack. Well, I admit I've done wrong, and I apologise. But if Sarah Cox is entitled to anything, she's only entitled to nominal damages, because first of all, she's a young and not unattractive woman, and there are some images of her in here. In her early days, she was painted, and there's a nice painting of her in here as a young lady, and then in later life, there are also some photographs. And she's quite, I wouldn't say beautiful, but she's quite striking, and in later life she's especially striking. So he had a point to some degree. And the second point he made was, because there are 3 men for every woman in this colony, if a lady as attractive as Sarah Cox can't find another husband, she's not trying, and therefore the damages should be nominal. So anyway, Wentworth goes in again and convinces the court, and young Sarah gets 100 guineas in damages. A lot of money. What the court didn't know was, at the time, that Wentworth and young Sarah had started an affair during the case. And as a result of this, 9 months later, their first child, a daughter, was born. Then they started living together. Then another child was born. Then they decided they better get married. And then I think they had 8 other children. And they lived not always happily, because Wentworth was a bit of a naughty boy himself. But they lived until he died 47 years later, and you'd have to say on balance it was a very successful union, as these things go. And this is one of the reasons why I think years later, when Government House became a very snooty place, and it hadn't always been a snooty place, but when it did become a snooty place, the Wentworths had a lot of trouble with, sort of, so to speak, what passed for high society in New South Wales. And it was a little bit like, it even happens today to some extent. You know, everybody can remember a very, very notorious court case. You just remember. And perhaps the biggest one of all in our lifetimes that we'll ever see, we just had another reminder of recently, the Lindy Chamberlain case. They're just cases nobody ever forgets. And I think this case of Sarah Cox was a case they never forgot. And that's why later on the Wentworths weren't really welcome at Government House. The other story I wanted to tell was about New Zealand. And we're going forward here now to about 1840 for the main part of this story. New Zealand started its European history a bit differently to New South Wales. James Cook had touched there just before coming to the east coast of Australia in 1770, but New Zealand wasn't settled in the way that New South Wales was in 1788, and it remained a lawless place. And it remained a place where ex-convicts and convicts on the run would go to, whalers, in a sense to some degree pirates really you might say, and other assorted riffraff. And things got out of hand. The Maori tribes were at war with each other, especially North Island versus South Island, and they were arming themselves by trading land for guns and ammunition from these runaway convicts and so forth. And by the late 1830s it was getting very ugly. So much so that some of the Maori chiefs approached the British government representatives and said, we'd like the protection of Queen Victoria in relation to certain guarantees, and to try and stop this bloodshed and just calm things down in a way that we can't do ourselves. So the government said all right, and a naval captain called Hobson was sent out to Sydney to go on to New Zealand to reach a treaty with the Maori tribes. He came here first. By this time the governor was a fellow called Gibbs, got his riding instructions and went on to New Zealand. In 1840, 1841, and this is a great one to remind your New Zealand friends about when they're causing you grief. I've got New Zealand friends who cause me grief. That in 1840, 1841, in British eyes at least, New Zealand was a dependency of New South Wales. New Zealanders hate being told that, by the way. They don't believe it, first of all, and then they hate it when they realise it's in fact correct. So Hobson goes off to the North Island of New Zealand to a place called Waitangi, and in February 1840 signs up essentially the North Island chiefs. The South Island chiefs, meanwhile, come to New South Wales, come to Sydney to sign up with the governor. I think because they were concerned they might be in danger if they tried to go onto the North Island where there'd been these conflicts. So they came to see Governor Gibbs at the old Government House. Where are we? Somewhere around here, down there somewhere. I think, yeah, down there. And he said, I'll have these deeds ready for you in a couple of days. Here are a couple of guineas each. Go and enjoy yourselves and come back and they'll be ready to sign. So they wouldn't have gone to King's Cross in those days. They probably would have gone to the Rocks, I think. A couple of days later, the governor's waiting for them to come back to Government House. Nothing happens. Finally, one of the aides has the courage to say, when the governor asks, well, Your Excellency, they're not coming. He says, what do you mean they're not coming? Well, they've been down to Mr. Wentworth's legal office and he's given them some advice. And the advice is that your deal is not good enough. And he's offered them a better deal. And the governor said, what do you mean? And the aide said, well, Mr. Wentworth and his friend John Jones, the ship's captain who brought the Maori chiefs over, they bought the South Island of New Zealand from these Maori chiefs. well, Governor Gibbs, I should say, that's the deed whereby Wentworth and John Jones bought the South Island of New Zealand, and all the Maori chiefs signed with their moko, which is a part of their Maori tattoo, an identifying part of their tattoo, which is their signature. Now, I had this document taken out of the Mitchell Library safe and had a good look at it, You can write a good book. If you get a chapter like this wrong, it goes straight into the pulping machine when somebody finds out. So I actually went to Wellington, and they've got a counterpart deed in Wellington in the Turnbull Library, which is a wonderful library. If you go to Wellington, you should go and have a look if you haven't already. They've got the counterpart deed. It is a true story. Gipps, who wanted to next be Governor-General of Canada, worried about what the British government thought of him, realised he wouldn't even get to be Governor of Newgate Jail if this deed remained in force. So he set about knocking it over. And he called the Legislative Council together. Remember, I said 1840, so we're back before an elected legislature. They were all appointees, and basically they did what he wanted, which was to retrospectively legislate this deed out of existence. Now, some judges I've told, Wentworth's defence, I should say, by the way, was, well, just a minute, you've treated these Maoris very differently to the Aborigines. Your predecessors never recognised Aboriginal title, but what you've done with the Treaty of Waitangi is to recognise Maori land title. So I got in first with my deed on the South Island, and it's first in, best dressed, finders keepers, all those other cliches. Good night, I've prevailed. This just made Gipps angrier, and in the end he passed legislation to declare this deed null and void. And the judges I've spoken to about this say that Wentworth had a good case, they think, to go further. That in effect Gipps had acted illegally and he couldn't purport to do what he did, even under the law of those days. Now just very briefly and finally, Wentworth, the man, physically, I said he was 6'5", according to Carol Liston, I don't dispute that. Massive booming voice, grating sort of accent, sharp-witted, able to turn interjectors around at public meetings. We know that because there are transcripts of meetings with the actual interjections back and forth and stuff. But to get to the essence of it and try to write about this guy, you sort of think, well, who would he be like? Well, we know from what Sir Henry Parkes wrote, who was one of his great contemporaries, that there was nobody like Wentworth in his own day. There were great men, and regrettably all the people in public life in those days were men, and some very, very talented. One later became the Home Secretary and Chancellor of the Exchequer of a British government, believe it or not, a guy called Robert Lowe, who'd been in the Labor Parliament here. Even the likes of him and Parkes himself, they all said Wentworth stood head and shoulders above us. So then you come into more modern times and you think, who might there be who would match Wentworth on the podium, who could take him on in a debate, who could best him out in the domain in the good old days? And you know, my grandfather took me once to see Menzies, great speaker. I don't think a patch for various reasons on Wentworth. People like Whitlam, Howard, Keating, Hawke, all good speakers, all very good speakers. None of them a patch on Wentworth. Billy Hughes, who I've seen newsreels of, extraordinary man in his own way. Again, I don't think a patch on Wentworth. There's only one fellow I've ever seen or know of who I think might match him. Long time ago I went to Sydney Grammar, and we're all 15, 16-year-olds. I only remember two things at grammar. I never left my name on an honour roll. It was always scratched under the desk. That sort of contribution. And I only remember two things at grammar. One was going to watch the Armstrong and Aldrin landing on the moon, and the other was to watch a guest speaker. So we all get into the science block, lecture theatre, and the seats are all arrayed up like this and the speaker down the bottom sort of thing. And we're all sort of flicking at each other as 16-year-old boys are, rubber bands going off all over the place, chewing gum, all sorts of other, rulers, the whole thing, dreadful lot, really. And this old fellow shuffles in, and he's all bent over. He's so bent over he couldn't even look up at us. And he just didn't make any impression initially. He had a wire running down from his ear into his pocket. And then he started to speak. And all of a sudden, the whole room fell silent in a way that they wouldn't even fall silent for the headmaster and say, 25 teachers tactically deployed around the room. We were transfixed by this bloke. He had a lower jaw like a steam shovel, and he growled, and he had this incredible presence. And his name, of course, was Jack Lang. And I'd never say Jack Lang had the right politics, But in terms of having a persona, even in his 90s, as he was on this day, it was a moment, we have reunions from time to time, it's a moment most of us have never forgotten. And if they held the debate today out in the Domain, and they said it's about between Wentworth and Lang, getting DNA from their descendants or something to sort of reconstitute them, and they had a debate, I reckon there'd be a real toss-up as to who might win it. My sentimental favourite, of course, would be Wentworth, but I'd never be sure. Thank you. I sort of finished what I was going to say, so I don't know if there are any questions.
Just wondering about the Sydney Society at the time. I've worked as a guide, so we tell a lot of family stories, and a lot of, I guess, the narrative that we're giving about the family is that social divide with the exclusivists like the McCarthys, and then someone like your native-born, self-made but convict-connected level of society. And that his convict parentage sort of drove his early, cause for the battler in a way. Do you think is that sort of a bit of an urban myth?
No, I think it's got elements of the facts about it. I think the turning point with Wentworth was when, his the father's background was revealed, but not exactly correctly. And that sort of transfixed him and turned him away from that sort of traditional career at the English bar into coming back here and, as he put it, I'll read it to you. It's in here somewhere. He wrote this in 1817, not long after he found out about his father. He wrote to Lord Fitzwilliam, this is the 15th of January 1817, and announced his intention to study for the bar, to acquaint himself with all the excellence of the British Constitution, to advocate successfully the right of my country to participation in its advantages. And I just sort of say that's the most extraordinary declaration of a future career that any Australian will ever utter. Because I think that, certain people are born and live at critical times in their country's history. And just like there are probably people today in the United States who live in obscurity, but who, if they'd lived in the 1770s, might well have been capable of being founding fathers, if you see what I'm saying. And Wentworth was one of those people who was lucky enough to live at the sort of founding of his country and had the ability to capitalise on it. That also, though, makes him difficult to pigeonhole back here. I get a sense a lot of the exclusives didn't quite know how to handle Wentworth because he was a barrister and he was also connected to this extraordinary Wentworth family in England, and they didn't quite know how to tackle him. So they tended to go at him through his wife. That's my sense of it, and but nevertheless the combined effect was the same. I don't think he cared all that much, but I think he cared because she cared, and I think it wounded her and it wounded the daughters. And, she was hurt by it. That's my sense of it. And he cared for that reason, because despite all his mucking around and nonsense, he cared for his wife. There's no doubt about that, I think. And, but, Government House is a movable feast. So when the Wentworths were on Norfolk Island, and Lieutenant King, later the governor, was in charge of Norfolk Island in the early days, he actually had a convict mistress. And he had a couple of children with a convict mistress. And then later on, when he went to England and brought back a Cornish wife, somehow or other the Cornish wife and the convict mistress and all this mixed family managed to sort of get on together in the broader sense of the word, while he carried on happily as governor. So in the early days, it was a different place. And a lot of the sort of exclusive, us and them type attitude arose, it seems to me, in the later 1820s. And
what about the fact that his mother was certainly a convict? Did he accept this, and did this cause him embarrassment like that?
Oh, I think he accepted it, and I don't think it bothered him. I don't think it bothered him particularly. There are debates on that. There are debates on everything to do with Wentworth. And I'm not saying I'm right, I just have a particular interpretation. You have to take a view and write it. But this is the first biography of Wentworth, believe it or not, which I find astonishing. And first full biography, I should say. There've been one or two much shorter books, but this is the first full one. But there could probably be 30 books written about Wentworth and you wouldn't cover the field. You could probably write a big book on Wentworth's legal career, just on its own. Another book on Wentworth's career on the land. He's that sort of guy.
When did the Wentworth settle at Vaucluse?
About 1829, something, 1827, 29, somebody... 1827, somebody in the room know better than me. They bought it from Piper, I think.
And William Charles, he's still buried out there.
He's buried in a mausoleum, which is it's now on a separate piece of property, but it was once all joined up. And there's a road that runs in a couple of houses and stuff, and it's worth having a look at. The mausoleum's quite an impressive place. It's a rock. It's down into a huge rock, and there's little church-type buildings built on top of the rock. And again, people here will know better than me, but I think he's actually down on a rock somewhere. But in the early days, you could sit on that rock. He used to sit on that rock and he could see Sydney. That's a contradiction in terms today because we think of Sydney as all round Vaucluse. But in those days, my sense for Sydney was like being down, Vaucluse was like being down in Bowral. Compared to, its relationship to Sydney town was like sort of being down in Bowral today. That's when the M5's running on a good day, by the way. But he could sit on this rock and look at Sydney town, which was then some way in the distance. And he's buried inside the rock somewhere, as I understand it.
Did your regard for William Wentworth, was that a factor in your entering politics?
No. I came on him a lot later. No, I'd always wanted to get into politics. Not for any good reason than other, I just wanted to get into politics. Which as a former constituent you might not be happy to hear. But it might have gone back to the time my grandfather took me to see Menzies, I don't know. No, I got into Wentworth in a roundabout way. I'd written about Sydney and I couldn't get Sydney published. And I went to Allen and Unwin and they said, look, we think you can write, but we don't think Sydney's publishable because it's not Australian enough as a story. But if you can come up with a colonial figure, we'll have a look. And I was researching Gregory Blaxland because he lived out near my old electorate. And I looked very hard at Blaxland, but I don't think there's a book in Blaxland. And I kept coming across Wentworth and couldn't find a biography of him. And I then went to a couple of history professors I knew and said, is there a biography of Wentworth? And they said, no, well, not a full one. And I thought, righto, that's it, that's what I'm doing. And so I went to Allen and Unwin, pitched it. You put in a chapter plan and all that sort of stuff. And they said yes and gave me a contract, and that's how it happened. And then it was off the back of Wentworth. I won a prize for Wentworth. I just got over the line with Sydney, but only by the skin of my teeth. Allen and Unwin still wouldn't touch it. And I went to a publisher in Melbourne in the end to get Sydney done. So it's interesting. And unfortunately, it's now getting very hard to get anything published. And I think this news about Fairfax is catastrophic. And it's bad news for publishing too. Very bad news for publishing.
I was looking up Sydney about early 90s and I couldn't find anything on him because I wanted to look who made the name Sydney. This was before computers sort of, there was nothing I could find on Sydney, and that's why I came to hear your lecture because of...
Did you come last week?
Yes.
Oh, good. You wouldn't have learned much.
I'm just saying how you think they'd have, I was born in England, but you think they'd have something on Sydney, but I couldn't find a thing. I looked through encyclopedias and
there isn't anything, and it's because he got done down in his own day with that story, and history bypasses a lot of people, and I just try to find stories that haven't been done. That's what I'm interested in, rather than doing another version of a story that's been told. And one of the things that amazes me is just how much of Australian history hasn't been told, and what I think is pretty fundamental Australian history. So there are big gaps. There are still really big gaps. And some history departments, I don't know what they teach. It's some of the subjects on curriculum these days in history departments are just beyond me.
You've always been rather thorough, and your research seems very thorough in this particular book. But is there anything that any sort of significant additions or revisions that you would have made to either book since publication?
Oh, gee, that's an interesting question. I think only very minor changes in the case of Wentworth. Nobody sort of really tackled me on any big problems. I'm not saying there aren't big problems in it. I don't know where they are. I wouldn't knowingly let a book go out with a big problem in it. That's not to say there aren't some, but no one's sort of picked any up, and it's been reviewed by a number of people now. So it seems to me that it's basically okay, and so far the same with Sydney. Sydney's a bit more problematic though, because there are large slabs of it which involve British history and North American history, and there may yet be some problems there which Australians mightn't necessarily pick up, and I'm always mindful of that there might be some bloopers in there. Alan Atkinson and others who've helped me on both books, academics, always say, well, look, we're not experts on British history, so we can't really vouch for this stuff. So who knows, there might be problems, but so far so good. I would have liked more length. This is 80,000 words, and I'd originally written about 120,000, and the publisher said too much, you've got to cut it back, and then they didn't trust me to do it, so they put an editor on the job, and she just went to town. It's a better book for what she's done, by the way, but I wouldn't have minded some extra stuff in there. For example, they said you've got far too much stuff in here on politics, and you've got far too much stuff in here on the law. I had a number of other court cases that interested me, and the editor said, look, they might interest you because you're a lawyer, but you're going to bore the general public rigid, so they've got to come out. They're sort of tangent from the narrative. You've got to get rid of them. And so this is what happens. They don't give you long to do that, by the way. They put a deputy editor, a former deputy editor of Time magazine on this manuscript I'd done of Wentworth, and she disappeared with it for about 8 weeks, I think, and then came back, and it was handed to me with 30,000 words taken out, in the sense that she'd gone through it with a pencil, and it sort of put lines through things and little arrows everywhere and all sort of thing. And then I was given 12 days to respond. And they said, no, 12 days only. And it's deliberate, you see, because they really don't want you unpicking the editor's work. And so I work 14 hours a day to try and sort of, but I found I couldn't work more than 14 hours a day. After 40, just physically, utterly exhausted. Your eyes start to cross, you can't focus, and you just got to get some sleep. And there are parts of it that run rough. There are parts in here, and I know where they are, where the actual flow runs roughly, and it irritates me even now to sort of read it and think, gee, if I had another 2 weeks, I could have polished it more. When with editing, one of the things I found that was very difficult to respond is, like, I've only read about this, but people sort of who are unfortunate enough to lose a limb, it's often said that they have a sort of phantom feeling afterwards that they still have a leg or they still have an arm or something. And I found that when 30,000 words are taken out, you still have a phantom thought that the 30,000 words are there. I'm not joking. And it's quite difficult. It's quite difficult to come to terms with the loss of your words. I'm sure an amputee would say, get serious. But it's true.
First of all, can I suggest you post that material
I
online?
was just going to say, blog it.
Oh.
What I was wanting to ask, I also work at Bolton's House, and a lot of the rooms are furnished on the basis of inventories from when household goods were sold. And in the breakfast room, over the doorway as you exit, if you look up, there's a portrait of Oliver Cromwell.
It's in the book.
So, not having read the book, I wanted to ask you please to talk about what aspects of Oliver Cromwell William Charles would have admired, because obviously there's the link in terms of the advocacy for democratic rights, but I wonder how far William Charles's resentment of established authority went. Was he really keen to overthrow the whole system at any point?
Oh, no, certainly not. And he always worked within the system, and he would go right to the edge, and then he did seem to have a knack at the last minute of pulling back. He did seem to know where to stop. And I don't think he would have seriously entertained the idea at any stage that the sort of force that Cromwell had employed was necessary. And I think the big change was, well, apart from the fact that Cromwell had won the Civil War, although after that it unravelled again, that settlement, and they then had to go through the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and all that stuff. But the seminal event as far as colonies was concerned was the American Revolutionary War. And there was never any sense that the British government would hold up constitutional demands of native-born Australians, there was dragging of the feet for a while because the British government thought that the granting of those rights would undermine the deterrent effect of transportation. But there also, that wasn't just a British fight alone. There were colonials who also believed that, and there were people like the MacArthurs, who in the early days didn't want trial by jury here either, because they said, well, who are our peers going to be? They're not going to be convicts. There's always great fight going on about, okay, so we'll have juries, but who's going to be on a jury? We'll have the vote, but who's going to vote? You're going to include ex-convicts. And in the early years, that was a huge break on constitutional reform. And so what I'm saying is the British government, which wanted to maintain the deterrent effect of transportation, actually had some natural allies here, the exclusives. But then later on, when people migrated in very large numbers, the whole convict question was just sort of overcome. Do you know what I'm saying? And they went on to other issues. It was swamp that was bypassed. It sort of became irrelevant. I don't think he ever really felt the need that he had to go outside the system in that sense. The closest he ever got to it was with Darling, but they dispatched Darling. They dispatched Darling. As for New Zealand, well, that was a fight between him and Gibbs. That wasn't really a fight that involved, the rights of people generally. People, guides and so forth, I always hold my breath because I think I've made a mistake. There are always Wentworth descendants, who turn up, and they're formidable people because there's a very strong strain of Wentworth DNA. Billy Wentworth, Wentworth's great-grandson, who was a member of the Federal House of Parliament for a while, and he was brilliant. He was too smart for his own good. There's a story about him. He was a captain in the militia at the beginning of World War II, and they held an exercise, and Captain Wentworth was told to sort of, with his command or whatever, hold the southern suburbs of Sydney or something, and the plan was that the enemy general would be sort of ensconced in the Sydney CBD. Well, this wasn't good enough for Captain Wentworth, so he decided to leave Sutherland or wherever he was, and he mounted a campaign and actually captured the enemy general in the Sydney CBD and embarrassed the military hierarchy, and they said to him, Wentworth, we don't think you're suitable for the military, and they sent him off to the Treasury, and he spent the rest of the war in the Treasury doing rationing or something. But he was brilliant, and unfortunately for him, he got on the wrong side of Robert Menzies, and he spent most of his political career on the backbench, and only came to life for a short time, I think under Holt, I don't know about Holt, certainly under McMahon. And he did something. Wentworth was personally, I think, a benevolent employer of Aborigines, but some of his public comments about Aborigines were disgraceful, especially some comments about them in the New South Wales Parliament, just appalling, utterly appalling. And so much so I had difficulty writing about this and sort of coming to grips with this material. And one of the great things the great-grandson did was to champion the rights of Aborigines to be counted in a referendum and that sort of thing. So the great-grandson actually redeemed the Wentworth name when it came to Aboriginal affairs. But Wentworth, this boy, was a shocker on public comments about Aborigines as distinct from his private behaviour, which was, as far as I can tell, quite generous.
Any thoughts on how Wentworth joined Blaxland and Lawson, just from the point of view that he was the odd man out, like they were much older than him, they were exclusives, and he may not have, well, certainly his father was a strong emancipist and he may have been generating those views, but so he seemed to be the odd man out, yet how did he... Blaxland
was an exclusive, but in those days funnily enough, it was crossing the Blue Mountains, I think, that began Blaxland's anger with Macquarie. Macquarie wasn't very keen for him to cross the mountains, and only grudgingly sort of agreed that he should go. And when he came back, Macquarie, I don't think was all that enthused about the news initially. And my suspicion's always been that he was worried that convicts would get over the hill and far away and he'd lose control of the place. Later on, about a year later, he warmed up a little bit, but he always gave the credit to Cox and Evans. And that was always a bone of contention with Blaxland, and Blaxland ultimately turned against Macquarie big time. So I don't know that Blaxland was a huge exclusive at the time of the crossing of the mountains. That came later. As for Lawson, I don't think Lawson was ever an exclusive. Lawson had been I think he came out here as a lieutenant, and he was a surveyor, but he didn't wear, I don't get a sense, the exclusive tag very much. But what they shared in common was they were all landowners. And young Wentworth had been granted some land by Macquarie out near the Nepean River somewhere, and they all had a problem with finding grazing land for their livestock. We're trying to find and hope they'd find grazing land on the other side of the Blue Mountains, and that was the incentive. I mean, at that stage there were only about 12,000 people in New South Wales, which is probably less than your average Sydney suburb. The Cumberland Plain still wasn't big enough for all the cattle in a bad year, and that's why they were looking elsewhere, as I understand it.
All right, I'd like to thank Andrew.
Thanks.